When the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began in February 2022, many predicted that the economy of the world's largest country would enter a tremendous crisis and recession, with some even expecting a decline of up to 10%. Although after more than 3 years of conflict, Russia managed to sustain its economy, it seems that the situation is no longer the same, and the prolongation of the war is already beginning to take its toll, forcing the Russians and Putin to face their worst economic crisis in recent years. This crisis could lead to Putin lacking the tremendous resources needed to sustain the war and would pave the way for the initiation of a possible agreement with Ukraine in the face of pressure from Trump. To understand the magnitude of Putin's problem, let's remember that Russian military spending is estimated to reach a staggering $149 billion in 2024, which corresponds to 7.1% of Russia's GDP and 19% of all government spending. To give you an idea of how expensive it is to sustain the war, it is estimated that the military budget will have increased by 38% in 2024 compared to 2023. Defense spending is about 7 times higher than that of a country with a similar population like Brazil, which spends $21.7 billion annually on military investment. This is undoubtedly unsustainable and is increasingly leading Russia to skyrocketing public spending, resulting in inflation levels that, according to unofficial sources, are above 10% annually. But how did Russia manage to sustain its economy during these 3 years without falling into recession? Why have things changed? And is it now possible that the Russians are beginning the worst economic crisis in recent years? Will an economic crisis then be the trigger that will force Putin to give in to Trump and reach an agreement with Zelensky, as Trump intends? We'll see below. In previous years, Russia successfully evaded trade sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union by increasing its exports to China and India, which became the 2 main markets, becoming the destination for the majority of exports. Together, these 2 countries account for almost 50% of Russian exports, especially oil and gas. Another country that became a destination for Russian exports was Turkey, which increased its share from 4.1% to almost 8%, as did other nations such as Hungary and Kazakhstan. Among these countries, Russia managed to offset its previous export share with European countries, which now represent less than 15% of exports, compared to more than 50% before the start of the conflict. The strategy to evade sanctions was to use a ghost fleet of ships, which is estimated to account for 70% of total oil exports to China, Turkey, and India. However, this situation has led some analysts, such as Alina Rybakova, an economist at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, to suggest that Russia and Putin have become a vassal of China and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The commercial importance that China now has for Russia is completely disproportionate, as the Asian giant is by far the main trading partner, while Russia only accounts for a small portion of Chinese exports. Additionally, Russia is almost entirely dependent on Asian countries for manufactured and technological products, increasing its dependence on China. Thanks in large part to Chinese support, during 2023 and 2024, the Russian economy managed to perform extraordinarily despite the conflict, even reaching growth close to 4%, well above economies that appear to be more stable, such as Germany. However, that situation appears to be coming to an end, and recently, Russian Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov himself acknowledged that the economy is going through a difficult period and is very close to a recession. Some analysts have even predicted that this economic crisis could lead to Putin losing popularity and support within the country, possibly leading him to give in to negotiations in the conflict with Ukraine. Let's review the causes of the Russian economic crisis, which could even lead to a collapse of public finances. The first cause is undoubtedly the prolonged conflict, which has now lasted more than 3 years. While high military spending may have initially favored economic growth, over time, the initial investment in weapons has ultimately failed to improve the productivity of the Russian economy. Or, to put it more bluntly, the spending on tanks, ammunition, and weapons in recent years has done nothing to increase the productivity of Russian industry to produce goods in the future or improve its competitiveness. And of course, these tremendous war expenditures have fiscal impacts that accumulate over time, which have fueled the recent rise in inflation, leading to higher interest rates. The high rates have led to an increase in loan defaults for both companies and individuals. Some analysts even warned that the worst crisis in the Russian banking system's history could be brewing, one that could explode at any moment. A few years ago, the government pressured banks to provide loans to boost the economy, but with high interest rates that have reached as high as 21%, lenders' ability to pay is becoming increasingly difficult. With these tremendous interest rates, credit card delinquency rates have skyrocketed, as the interest charged by banks has reached over 50% annually. In recent months, a total of 8,300,000 credit cards are more than 90 days late, with an estimated overdue portfolio of over $7.3 billion. Worst of all, official figures may be hiding part of the truth, and to avoid an economic panic, exact figures on defaults are not being made public. The recent report from the Russian central bank showed how critical the crisis is that of the 78 largest Russian companies, 13 had solvency problems paying their financial obligations, a figure 100% higher than the figures from a year earlier. Elvira Nabiullina, governor of the central bank, also stated that in recent years, military spending had been sustained thanks to the resources available, but these reserves are already being depleted. Nabiullina recalled how at the beginning of the war, the Russian National Wealth Fund had savings of $300 billion, but due to the prolonged war, the current resources are less than $140 billion. Additionally, due to the sanctions imposed at the beginning of the war, more than $300 billion in Russian account abroad have been frozen. Economic reports show real inflation rates hovering around 15%. Even the so-called Borscht Index, which tracks basic food prices, shows that meat and vegetable prices have increased by more than 60% in the last year. The central bank had set an inflation target of 4% by the end of the year, but analysts believe it will not be achieved and that, on the contrary, the central bank will have to maintain high rates, close to 20%, for a long time, further affecting credit payments and economic growth. If the economic sanctions recently announced by President Trump materialize, and if a negotiated solution to the war is not sought, the situation could become even more complicated, pushing the banking sector into a tremendous crisis. In the last quarter, the economic slowdown was noticeable in sectors such as mining, commerce, housing, and recreational activities. Another reason for the tremendous economic decline has been the migration of young people, as many workers, especially in the technology sector, have preferred to leave for other countries, given the ease with which they find work in places not immersed in armed conflict. But migration isn't limited to young professionals. Thousands of students have also migrated out of fear of being sent to the front lines in Ukraine. Some were tricked by the government into signing contracts guaranteeing them a university education, but in return, the young men had to serve 3 years of military service. While many young men were willing to lose these 3 years in the army in exchange for studying, that was before the start of the war. Many young men don't want to be used as cannon fodder on the front lines and have preferred to flee to neighboring countries like Georgia. Some openly admit they don't want to kill anyone, nor do they want to end up in prison for deserting. The situation is so complicated that, according to human rights organizations, there are currently more than 1,000 trials for desertion. There are even cases of soldiers who abandoned their uniforms and left the ranks right in the middle of the war. It is estimated that more than 1 million working-age people, who were crucial to the productive sector, have migrated since the beginning of the war. Additionally, Russia is already beginning to experience a demographic problem with an increasingly aging population. The Minister of Labor recently stated that by 2030, nearly 11 million migrants will be needed in the economy. By 2024, births were expected to reach 1.2 million, while deaths were significantly higher at 1.8 million. The birth rate is only 1.4%, among the 10 worst among so-called emerging economies. It is estimated that by 2030, only 63% of the population will be working, compared to 72% in 2010, due to the aging of the population. This situation has led to a shortage of nearly 2.7 million workers, with inflation at 9.5% and interest rates that reached over 20%. The situation is so critical that the government has had to seek migrants from poor countries like Afghanistan and North Korea to somehow fill the labor shortage. Putin himself recently acknowledged that there is a risk of recession or stagnation, but without being clear about the plan to revive the economy, he stated that a recession should not be allowed under any circumstances. The big problem is that Putin is likely considering more government stimulus, which ultimately adds fuel to fire, as it could lead to a worse increase in public spending and inflation. The situation is so complex that he estimates that potential economic growth will be close to 1%, due to a drop in investment and consumption. The crisis has also been exacerbated by the fall in oil prices, which reached $60 per barrel a few months ago. This is a critical element for public finances, as 29% of government revenue comes from energy and raw material production. While oil prices were expected to reach over $90 by 2022, the situation has changed radically in the last year. Overall, oil prices have fallen by an average of 26%, while defense spending has increased by 12% compared to the previous year. According to some analysts, this entire situation could lead Putin to give in to Trump and agree to a ceasefire with Ukraine. Putin has already ordered a reduction in military spending, which has reached 6.5% of GDP, and some media outlets report that attempts are being made to arrange a summit between Putin and Zelensky. Of course, the problem is for the two sides to reach an agreement on the territorial issue, as both leaders will not want to appear to be losers after such a long conflict with so many losses in lives and resources. Furthermore, Putin has recently received some bad news. NATO member countries agreed to increase their military spending by 5% of GDP, which will imply greater military support for Ukraine if the war continues. Therefore, if Russia decided to extend the conflict, it would need to have extremely high military spending to avoid being defeated by the West. It cannot be ruled out that the parties will begin to come closer and, little by little, with Trump as mediator, an agreement between Putin and Zelensky will be reached, as ultimately, a prolonged conflict would continue to harm the people and economies of both countries. Remember that in the video description, you will find a link to the best course to learn technical and fundamental analysis for investing in stocks. You'll also find a link to the best platform for buying stocks on the stock exchange, regulated in the United States. If you enjoyed the video, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and share the content.